The desert wind carried the acrid smell of burning fuel and cordite across forward operating base Thunder, where the morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan landscape. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush mountains cut sharp silhouettes against a sky that promised another day of triple-digit heat and unrelenting tension. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Corporal Veena Granada adjusted the faded red cross on her dusty ACU sleeve as she walked between the rows of MRAP vehicles lined up in the motor pool. Her combat boots crunched against the gravel that seemed to find its way into everything on the base, from equipment to meals to the spaces between her teeth. The medic patch on her uniform had once been vibrant red and white, but months of desert conditions had bleached it to a dull pink, much like her hopes of ever being seen as anything more than a bandage wrapper in this testosterone-fueled environment. She paused beside a massive MATV, its armor plating scarred from IED fragments and small arms fire, its bulk casting a welcome shadow in the relentless heat. Through the thick, bulletproof glass, she could see her own reflection wavering in the superheated air, distorted and somehow smaller than she felt inside. Once, she had dreamed of carrying more than medical supplies into combat zones. That dream felt like a lifetime ago. "Granada, get over here!" Staff Sergeant Derek Thompson's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. Veena turned to see him standing near a cluster of soldiers gathered around an M240 machine gun mounted on a gun truck, his desert camouflage uniform somehow still managing to look crisp, despite the conditions that left everyone else looking like they'd been through a sandstorm. His combat boots gleamed despite the omnipresent dust, and his grin was wide and predatory as he gestured toward her. "Look what we've got here, boys," Thompson called out to the group of infantry soldiers preparing for the day's patrol briefing. "Our resident pill pusher thinks she belongs near the real weapons." His voice carried that particular tone of mockery that made Jessica's jaw tighten, loud enough for everyone to hear, casual enough to seem like harmless military banter. Sergeant First Class Mike Crawford, Thompson's usual partner in these daily humiliation rituals, joined in with an exaggerated shake of his head. "Maybe we should strap a first aid kit to the turret. Granada here could patch up bullet holes while we're laying down suppressive fire." The group erupted in laughter, the sound echoing off the concrete barriers and prefab buildings that made up their small outpost in the middle of hostile territory. Veena felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned over the past 18 months that reacting only made it worse. Instead, she checked the medical bags slung across her shoulder and continued her walk toward the aid station, their laughter following her like the persistent buzz of desert flies. What Thompson and the others didn't know, what nobody had bothered to ask or investigate, was that Veena Granada hadn't started as a medic. 2 years ago, she'd been Corporal Granada, designated marksman trainee, ranking second in her advanced marksmanship class at Fort Benning. She'd logged over 300 hours on long-range shooting systems, mastered every precision rifle in the Army's inventory, and earned commendations for her ability to place rounds exactly where they needed to go at distances that made other soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. Her instructors had called her a natural, one of those rare soldiers who seemed to understand instinctively the complex mathematics of long-range shooting, wind compensation, bullet drop, atmospheric pressure, temperature variations, and the dozens of other variables that turned precision marksmanship from a skill into an art form. During training exercises at various ranges, Veena had consistently outperformed soldiers with years more experience, her shots clustering in groups so tight they looked like they'd been made by a machine rather than human hands. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was during a joint training exercise with the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. Veena had been assigned as a designated marksman to a simulated combat patrol, working alongside Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, one of the Army's most decorated snipers, and a man whose reputation in long-range shooting circles bordered on legendary. Hayes was old school, a career soldier who'd earned his stripes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had little patience for what he considered the Army's recent trend toward social experiments in combat units. Hayes' way. During the exercise, Veena had noticed irregularities in the wind patterns across the training range, subtle shifts in direction and velocity that could affect bullet trajectory at extended ranges. The meteorological data they'd been given didn't match what she was observing through her scope, and she documented every discrepancy, double-checked the atmospheric readings, and recommended adjustments to the firing solutions for the exercise's long-range engagement scenarios. Master Sergeant Hayes had not appreciated being corrected by a relative newcomer, especially one who challenged the established parameters of the training exercise. When Veena filed a formal report detailing the atmospheric inconsistencies and their potential impact on mission success, Hayes accused her of overthinking simple problems and lacking the confidence necessary for combat shooting. "Real snipers don't second-guess every little wind shift," he'd told her in front of the entire training cadre. "They adapt and overcome. They don't hide behind calculations and weather reports when it's time to pull the trigger." The next day, during the exercise's culminating long-range engagement, 3 different designated marksmen missed their targets at a critical moment in the simulated battle scenario. The wind had shifted exactly as Veena had predicted, causing their carefully calculated shots to drift wide of their intended targets. The exercise was declared a failure, with enemy forces successfully completing their objective while the friendly forces failed to neutralize key targets. Veena had been right. The investigation proved it. But Master Sergeant Hayes was a decorated veteran with connections throughout the sniper community and a reputation that opened doors across the military. When the dust settled, Veena found herself reassigned to better utilize her attention to detail and analytical skills, military speak for being shuffled off to medical training where her precision and careful observation could be channeled into something the brass considered more appropriate for someone of her demographic. Her marksmanship qualifications weren't revoked outright, but they were buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape and reassignment orders that effectively ended her shooting career before it had really begun. She was qualified to engage targets at ranges most soldiers couldn't even see clearly, but she wasn't authorized to do anything more dangerous than check blood pressure and hand out aspirin. She'd gone from potential sniper to combat medic not by choice but by consequence of being right at the wrong time and in the wrong place in a system that valued conformity over competence when that competence came from an unexpected source. Now, as Thompson's laughter faded into the daily routine of patrol preparations and equipment checks, Veena made her way to the aid station, a reinforced concrete bunker that squatted between 2 blast walls like an afterthought in the base's defensive perimeter. The building's air conditioning unit wheezed against the desert heat, fighting a losing battle against the relentless sun that turned metal hot enough to brand skin and made every surface uncomfortable to touch. Inside, the familiar smell of antiseptic and medical supplies greeted her, clean, sterile, and completely at odds with the diesel fumes and gun oil that still made her heart race with memories of what she'd once hoped to become. She began her daily inventory, checking supplies, reviewing casualty protocols, and ensuring that everything was ready for whatever the day might bring. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind wandered to the Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle she'd seen in the arms room during a recent inventory count. The weapon was a monster, capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters with devastating effect. It was the kind of rifle that separated precision marksmen from ordinary infantry, the tool that could change the outcome of a battle with a single well-placed shot. Veena had qualified on the Barrett during her advanced training, had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between a hit and a miss at extreme range, had mastered the techniques necessary to place a half-inch bullet exactly where it needed to go from distances that seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't dedicated their life to the art of precision shooting. But having the knowledge and having the opportunity were 2 very different things in an army that had already decided what she was capable of and where she belonged. As Veena finished her morning routine, the base's communication system crackled to life with the day's patrol assignments. Thompson's name was called for a reconnaissance mission. Crawford received orders for a convoy escort. A dozen other soldiers got their assignments, their voices confident, as they acknowledged orders that would take them outside the wire and into harm's way. Veena's name was not called. It never was. She looked through the aid station's small bulletproof window at the motor pool, where the MRAPs sat like sleeping giants, their armor gleaming dully in the morning sun, their weapons systems ready for whatever the enemy might throw at them. The mountains in the distance shimmered with heat mirages, their peaks hiding valleys and ridgelines where hostile forces moved with impunity, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Thompson's voice carrying on the wind as he briefed his squad. And that's how real soldiers handle contact, Not like some people who spend their time counting bandages and taking temperatures instead of learning how to fight. Jessica closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of gun oil and diesel fuel drifted through the window, mixing with the antiseptic scent of her medical domain. She'd been invisible for 18 months now, dismissed and overlooked, relegated to a support role that kept her safely away from the kind of action that had originally drawn her to the military. But she was still here, still ready, still maintaining the skills that had once marked her as exceptional. Every night, when the base settled into its restless routine of guard shifts and perimeter checks, Jessica found her way to the observation posts, where she could practice reading wind patterns, calculating range estimates, and maintaining the mental discipline that separated precision shooting from simple marksmanship. The Taliban forces in the surrounding mountains had grown bolder recently, their attacks more coordinated, and their positions more difficult to locate and engage. Intelligence reports suggested they were planning something significant, something that would test every defensive capability the base possessed. Veena had a feeling that the day was coming when being right would matter more than fitting in, when precision would count for more than politics, and when the army would need every skilled shooter it could find, regardless of where they'd been assigned on some bureaucrat's organizational chart. That day was coming sooner than anyone imagined, and when it arrived, Veena Granada intended to be ready. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon heat had turned forward operating base Thunder into a furnace by the time Veena finished treating her third case of heat exhaustion. The aid station's air conditioning wheezed against the relentless Afghan sun, struggling to keep the temperature below 90 degrees while outside, the thermometer climbed past 115. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the shimmering heat waves rising from the concrete barriers that surrounded their small outpost, creating mirages that made the distant mountains dance like liquid. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez lay on the examination table, his desert camouflage uniform soaked with sweat despite having consumed nearly 2 liters of water during the morning patrol. His squad had returned from a reconnaissance mission along the northern perimeter, where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters had been moving equipment and personnel under cover of darkness. "How long were you outside the wire?" Veena asked, checking his pulse and blood pressure with the practiced efficiency that had made her the most trusted medic on the base, even among soldiers who wouldn't admit it publicly. 6 hours, Rodriguez replied, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "We were observing suspected movement in the valley beyond Ridge Point. Staff Sergeant Thompson wanted us to maintain position until we could get positive identification on the targets." Veena frowned as she reviewed his symptoms. 6 hours in this heat, even with proper hydration protocols, was pushing the limits of human endurance. She'd seen too many soldiers pushed beyond their physical capabilities by leaders more concerned with completing missions than preserving their troops' health. "Did you maintain proper water consumption intervals?" she asked, preparing an IV to restore his electrolyte balance. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably on the examination table. "Well, we were supposed to, but Thompson said excessive water breaks would compromise our position. He told us real soldiers don't need to drink every 5 minutes like civilians." The familiar anger flared in Veena's chest, but she kept her expression neutral as she inserted the IV needle with practiced precision. Thompson's machismo was going to get someone killed, and when it happened, it would be soldiers like Rodriguez who paid the price for their sergeant's ego. As she worked, Rodriguez studied her with curious eyes. "Doc, can I ask you something?" "Shoot," Veena replied, adjusting the IV flow rate. "Some of the guys were talking last night, and Corporal Jenkins said he saw you up in Tower 3 around midnight, looking through one of the scopes. He said you were doing something with calculations, writing in a notebook." Rodriguez paused, seeming to gather courage for his next question. Were you practicing shooting?" Veena's hand stilled for a moment. Tower 3 was one of the observation posts that offered the best view of the surrounding terrain, equipped with high-powered scopes for surveillance and target identification. She'd been using it to maintain her skills, practicing the mental discipline that kept her sharp even without live fire exercises. "I was doing meteorological observations," she said carefully, which was technically true. Reading wind patterns, atmospheric pressure, and temperature variations were essential components of long-range shooting, but they were also legitimate medical concerns for monitoring heat-related illnesses. Rodriguez nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Jenkins said you were looking at the far ridgeline, the one that's almost 4 kilometers out. He said you were moving the scope in patterns, like you were tracking something. 4 kilometers. Just over 400 meters. Well within the effective range of a Barrett .50 caliber rifle in the hands of someone who understood the complexities of extreme-range shooting. Veena had been practicing target identification and range estimation on that ridgeline for months, using the surveillance equipment to maintain skills that the Army seemed determined to waste. Surveillance is part of base security, Veena replied, checking Rodriguez's vital signs again. Medical personnel need to understand the tactical situation to prepare for potential casualties. It was another half-truth. She did need to understand the tactical situation, but not for the reasons she was implying. Every night, when the base settled into its defensive routine, Veena studied the terrain around their position with the eye of a sniper rather than a medic. She identified potential hide sites, calculated range cards for key terrain features, and mentally mapped firing solutions that could prove critical if the base ever came under serious attack. The Taliban had been probing their defenses for weeks, testing response times and looking for weaknesses. Intelligence reports indicated a significant buildup of enemy forces in the surrounding mountains, but the exact location and strength of these forces remained unknown. Conventional reconnaissance patrols like the one Rodriguez had just returned from were having limited success in gathering actionable intelligence, partly because they were operating according to standard infantry doctrine that hadn't adapted to the realities of fighting an enemy that knew the terrain better than they did. "Doc," Rodriguez said quietly, "can I tell you something without it leaving this room?" Veena looked at him carefully. Medical confidentiality was sacred, but she sensed he wanted to share something beyond health concerns. "What's on your mind?" "That patrol today, we weren't just doing reconnaissance. Thompson had us looking for specific targets, high-value individuals that intelligence thinks are operating in that valley." Rodriguez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We spotted what looked like a command post about 3.5 kilometers out, built into the rocks on the eastern slope. There were definitely people moving around, and they had equipment that looked like communications gear. 3.5 kilometers, 3,500 meters. Exactly the range mentioned in the mission briefing that Veena wasn't supposed to have access to, but had overheard during a staff meeting when she'd been delivering medical supplies to the command post." "What did Thompson do about it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nothing," Rodriguez said with frustration. "He said it was too far for positive identification, too far for effective engagement, and too far to risk sending a patrol to investigate. We spent 6 hours watching them through binoculars and scopes, but we couldn't do anything about it. Too far for conventional infantry weapons, certainly. The M4 carbines and M240 machine guns carried by standard patrols were effective out to maybe 800 meters under ideal conditions. The M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle, used by designated marksmen, could reach out to about 1,000 meters, but 3,500 meters was beyond the capability of anything in the unit's current arsenal. Except for the Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle locked away in the arms room, the weapon that could place a half-inch bullet precisely where it needed to go at ranges that seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't dedicated their life to understanding the science of long-range shooting. Thompson said we'd need air support or artillery to deal with a target at that range," Rodriguez continued. "But you know how long it takes to get approval for airstrikes, especially when we can't guarantee there are no civilians in the area." Veena knew exactly how long it took. Days, sometimes weeks, while targets moved and opportunities disappeared. The bureaucracy of modern warfare often moved slower than the enemy's ability to adapt and relocate. As she finished treating Rodriguez and prepared his discharge paperwork, Veena's mind was already working through the tactical problem he'd described. 3,500 meters to a suspected command post on the eastern slope. She'd studied that terrain feature extensively during her nighttime observation sessions, had calculated wind patterns and bullet trajectories for that exact location during dozens of mental exercises. The shot was possible. Difficult, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution, but possible for someone with the right training and equipment. The Barrett .50 caliber could reach that distance with devastating effect, and Veena had the skills to place the shot accurately despite the extreme range. What she didn't have was authorization, opportunity, or the support of a command structure that saw her as nothing more than a medic with delusions of grandeur. After Rodriguez left the aid station, Vina found herself alone with her thoughts and the persistent feeling that something significant was building in the mountains around them. The Taliban didn't establish command posts and move communications equipment without a specific purpose, and that purpose was unlikely to be anything favorable to the American forces trapped in their small outpost. She pulled out the notebook that Rodriguez had mentioned, the one where she recorded her nightly observations and calculations. Page after page of wind readings, atmospheric data, range estimates, and shooting solutions for terrain features that surrounded the base. To anyone else, it might look like the obsessive hobby of someone with too much time and too little responsibility. To Vina, it was preparation for a moment that she prayed would never come but feared was inevitable. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her uncomfortably of muzzle flashes and tracer rounds, Vina made her way to Tower 3 for another session of meteorological observations. The tower's elevated position offered an unobstructed view of the valley where Rodriguez's patrol had spotted the suspected command post. Through the high-powered scope, she could make out the rocky outcropping on the eastern slope, its natural camouflage making it nearly invisible to casual observation but perfectly positioned for someone who knew how to read terrain features and identify human activity. As she adjusted the scope's magnification and began her nightly routine of range estimation and wind reading, Vina noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were lights moving on the distant ridge, small and carefully concealed, but visible to someone who knew what to look for. The Taliban weren't just maintaining a command post in those mountains, they were expanding it, bringing in more personnel and equipment under cover of darkness. Whatever they were planning, it was going to be big enough to require significant coordination and resources. Vina opened her notebook and began recording everything she observed, documenting positions, movement patterns, and equipment signatures, with the methodical precision that had once marked her as exceptional among her peers. She calculated ranges to multiple target areas, noted wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, and mentally rehearsed the sequence of actions that would be required to engage targets at extreme distance. Chris, somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, an enemy force was preparing for something that would test every defensive capability the base possessed. When that moment came, the army would need every skilled shooter it could find, regardless of what their official job description said. Vina Granada had been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated for 18 months. But she had used that time wisely, maintaining skills that others had written off and preparing for a moment when precision would matter more than politics. In the distance, the lights continued to move through the darkness, and Vina continued to watch, calculate, and prepare for the day when being ready would make all the difference. The explosion that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of forward operating base Thunder came without warning, a thunderous roar that sent Vina tumbling from her narrow cot onto the concrete floor of her quarters. The blast wave rattled the reinforced windows and knocked equipment from shelves throughout the building, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds that every soldier learned to recognize and fear. "Incoming! All personnel to bunkers!" The base alarm system screamed through speakers that crackled with static and urgency. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the compound, casting everything in an eerie red glow that turned familiar spaces into scenes from a nightmare. Vina grabbed her aid bag and helmet, muscle memory guiding her through the darkness as more explosions erupted around the base perimeter. This wasn't the random harassment fire they'd grown accustomed to over the past months. This was a coordinated attack, precisely timed and devastatingly accurate. The Taliban had been watching, learning, and planning, and now they were putting that knowledge to deadly use. She sprinted toward the aid station through a maze of concrete barriers and sandbags, dodging shrapnel that sparked off the walls around her. Above the chaos of explosions and shouting soldiers, she could hear the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles engaging targets at extreme range. The enemy had established overwatch positions in the mountains, using the elevated terrain to rain death down on the trapped American forces. The aid station was already filled with casualties when she arrived. Staff Sergeant Thompson lay on one of the examination tables, his left arm mangled by shrapnel, and his face pale with shock and blood loss. Beside him, two younger soldiers moaned in pain while Corporal Jenkins worked frantically to stop bleeding from multiple fragment wounds. "Where's Dr. Morrison?" Vina shouted over the sound of another mortar barrage impacting near the motor pool. "Trapped in the command bunker!" Jenkins replied without looking up from his patient. "Direct hit on the building. The doc's alive but can't get out. You're all we've got right now." Veena immediately took charge, her medical training overriding the chaos around her. She triaged the wounded with swift efficiency, prioritizing treatments based on severity and survivability rather than rank or personal relationships. Thompson's arm was savable but would require immediate surgery. The two younger soldiers had superficial wounds that looked worse than they were. A fourth casualty, brought in while she worked, had taken a sniper round through the shoulder and was bleeding internally. As she worked to stabilize Thompson, he grabbed her wrist with his good hand. "Granada," he gasped, his voice strained with pain and something that might have been respect. "They've got us pinned down. Snipers in the mountains, at least 3 different positions. We can't even get to the defensive positions without taking fire." "How far out?" Veena asked, inserting an IV to replace his lost blood volume. "Way out there. Has to be over 2,000 meters, maybe more. Nothing we've got can reach them." Thompson's grip tightened on her wrist. "They're picking us apart one shot at a time, and we can't do anything about it." Through the aid station's reinforced windows, Veena could see muzzle flashes winking from the distant mountains like deadly stars. Each flash was followed seconds later by the crack of a high-velocity round impacting somewhere within the base perimeter. The enemy snipers were methodically targeting anyone who showed themselves, turning the base into a prison where movement meant death. "Jenkins," she called to the corporal who was applying pressure bandages to the fragment wounds, "can you handle things here for a few minutes?" "Where are you going?" he asked, looking up with eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. "To get a better view of what we're dealing with," Veena replied, grabbing a pair of night vision goggles from the emergency equipment locker. She made her way through the base's underground tunnel system, a network of reinforced passages that connected key buildings and allowed movement without exposure to enemy fire. The tunnels were crowded with soldiers seeking shelter from the continuing barrage, their faces painted green by the emergency lighting and etched with the realization that they were facing something far more serious than the routine attacks they'd grown accustomed to. In the command bunker, she found chaos barely contained by military discipline. Colonel Patricia Walsh, the base commander, was trying to coordinate a defense while dealing with communication systems damaged by the initial mortar strikes. Radio operators worked frantically to establish contact with higher headquarters and request immediate air support. "How bad is it, sir?" Veena asked, approaching the tactical display that showed red markers indicating known enemy positions. Colonel Walsh looked up from the maps, her face grim with the weight of command decisions that could determine whether her soldiers lived or died. "Bad. We count at least 6 sniper positions in the mountains, all at extreme range. They've got us effectively surrounded and can engage any position on the base with precision fire." She pointed to the display, where red markers dotted the high ground around their position like a constellation of death. Intelligence was wrong about their capabilities. These aren't just Taliban fighters with old rifles. They've got modern equipment, trained marksmen, and perfect knowledge of our defensive positions. "What about air support?" Veena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 12 hours minimum, Walsh replied with barely contained frustration. "Weather's closing in to the north, and they've got higher priority missions supporting operations near Kandahar. We're on our own until tomorrow night at the earliest." 12 hours. An eternity when facing an enemy that could kill with impunity from positions beyond the range of every weapon the base possessed. Veena looked at the tactical display, mentally calculating ranges and angles of fire from the enemy positions to various points within the base perimeter. The farthest sniper position was marked at 3,700 meters, located on the same ridge where Rodriguez's patrol had spotted the command post. Someone had transformed that observation point into a fortress, complete with multiple firing positions and clear lines of sight to every critical facility on the base. "Sir," Veena said carefully, "what about the Barrett in the arms room?" Colonel Walsh shook her head. "Sergeant Martinez was our only qualified Barrett operator, and he rotated home last month. None of our current personnel are certified on that system." That wasn't entirely true, but Veena's qualifications had been buried so deeply in bureaucratic paperwork that most people had forgotten they existed. She could have corrected the colonel's assumption, but something held her back. Perhaps the memory of every dismissive comment and mocking laugh she'd endured over the past 18 months. Instead, she excused herself and made her way to Tower 3, the observation post where she'd spent countless nights practicing the skills that everyone assured her she'd never need. The tower's elevated position offered the best view of the enemy sniper positions, and its reinforced construction provided protection from all but direct hits. Through the high-powered scope, she could see the muzzle flashes clearly now, synchronized with the sound of impacts throughout the base. The enemy marksmen were working systematically, engaging targets of opportunity while maintaining fire discipline that spoke of professional training rather than enthusiastic amateurs. Veena opened her notebook and began recording everything she observed: range estimates, target identification, patterns of fire, and atmospheric conditions. The data painted a clear picture of an enemy force that had planned this attack down to the smallest detail, positioning themselves at ranges that put them beyond retaliation from conventional weapons, but not beyond the reach of a Barrett .50 caliber rifle in the hands of someone who understood the science of extreme-range shooting. As she worked, calculating wind drift and bullet trajectories for targets at distances that most soldiers considered impossible, Veena realized that her moment of truth was approaching faster than she'd anticipated. The base was under siege by an enemy that had carefully positioned itself beyond the reach of conventional response. When morning came, the defensive situation would become critical. Casualties would mount, supplies would dwindle, and morale would crumble under the constant threat of precision fire from invisible enemies. Unless someone could reach out and touch those snipers at ranges that defied conventional wisdom, forward operating base Thunder would become a tomb for everyone trapped within its walls. Veena Granada had spent 18 months being dismissed as just another medic, overlooked and underestimated by soldiers who measured worth by the size of one's rifle rather than the precision of one's shooting. But she had used that time to prepare for exactly this situation, maintaining skills that others had written off and studying terrain that would soon determine the fate of everyone she'd sworn to protect. The enemy had made one critical mistake in their otherwise perfect plan. They had assumed that the Americans possessed only the weapons and capabilities that appeared on official unit rosters. They had no way of knowing that hidden among the medical personnel was someone who could reach out 3,700 meters and deliver a half-inch bullet with surgical precision. Tomorrow, Veena would have to make a choice that would define not only her own future but the survival of everyone on the base. She could continue hiding her capabilities behind the safety of her medical assignment, or she could step forward and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapons come in the most unexpected packages. As another mortar round impacted near the base perimeter and the distant crack of sniper fire echoed through the mountains, Veena continued her calculations and prepared for the moment when being right would finally matter more than fitting in. Dawn broke over forward operating base Thunder like a blood-red wound across the Afghan sky, revealing the full extent of the devastation from the night's assault. Smoke rose from 3 separate buildings that had taken direct mortar hits, and the acrid smell of burning fuel mixed with cordite hung in the air like a toxic fog. Through the pre-dawn darkness, the enemy snipers had maintained their deadly vigil, turning any movement within the base perimeter into a potential death sentence. Veena hadn't slept. She'd spent the night moving between the aid station and Tower 3, treating casualties while simultaneously gathering intelligence on the enemy positions that held them all hostage. Her notebook was now filled with precise calculations: wind speed and direction at various altitudes, temperature gradients, atmospheric pressure readings, and most importantly, exact range measurements to each of the 6 confirmed sniper positions scattered throughout the mountains. The worst position, the one that commanded the greatest field of fire over the base, remained the fortified observation post at 3,700 meters on the eastern ridge. From that elevated position, a skilled marksman could engage virtually any target within the base perimeter, and the enemy sniper there had demonstrated his lethal capabilities throughout the night. Specialist Sarah Kim, barely 19 years old and 3 months into her first deployment, had been the latest casualty. She'd made the mistake of crossing open ground between the communications bunker and the supply depot during what she thought was a lull in the firing. The sniper's bullet had found her from over 3 kilometers away, a shot that spoke of professional training and equipment far beyond what intelligence had led them to expect. Kim now lay in the aid station's intensive care area, fighting for her life with a bullet wound that had missed her heart by less than 2 inches. As Veena worked to stabilize her condition, she could hear the young soldier's labored breathing and see the fear in her eyes, the fear of someone who had just learned that death could reach out and touch her from distances that seemed impossible. "Doc," Kim whispered through the oxygen mask that helped her breathe. How can they shoot so far? I thought we were safe back there. Veena adjusted the IV flow that was keeping Kim's blood pressure stable, her hands steady despite the anger building in her chest. Safe. No one was safe as long as those snipers controlled the high ground around the base. Every soldier, every support person, every cook and mechanic and radio operator was living on borrowed time while an enemy they couldn't reach picked them off one by one. "You're going to be fine," Veena told Kim, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The bullet had caused significant internal damage, and without proper surgical facilities, Kim's survival depended on evacuating her to a larger medical facility. But medical evacuation helicopters couldn't land while enemy snipers controlled the airspace around the base. Corporal Jenkins burst through the aid station's reinforced door, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Doc, we've got another one." Sergeant Miller took a round while trying to reach the radio tower. "He's alive but bleeding bad." Veena quickly prepared for another casualty, her mind automatically shifting into the clinical detachment that allowed her to function effectively under extreme stress. But part of her consciousness remained focused on the tactical problem that no one else seemed able to solve. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, using terrain and distance to create an almost impossible challenge for conventional military response. Almost impossible, but not entirely impossible for someone with the right training and equipment. As she worked on Miller's wounds, a through-and-through shot to the thigh that had narrowly missed the femoral artery, Veena found herself thinking about the Barrett rifle locked away in the arms room. The weapon was a monster, capable of delivering a .50 caliber bullet with devastating accuracy at ranges that defied conventional wisdom about infantry combat. More importantly, she knew that rifle intimately. During her advanced marksmanship training, she'd fired over 200 rounds through Barrett systems, learning to read the subtle wind patterns and atmospheric conditions that affected bullet trajectory at extreme range. She'd studied the ballistics tables until she could calculate firing solutions in her head, and she'd practiced the breathing techniques and trigger control that separated precision shooting from simple marksmanship. "Jenkins," she said as she finished treating Miller's wound, "how many more casualties can we handle before we're overwhelmed?" The corporal looked around the aid station, which was already crowded with wounded soldiers in various stages of treatment. "Maybe 2 or 3 more serious cases before we run out of space and supplies. After that..." He didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood the implications. The base's medical capabilities were finite, and the enemy seemed to understand that psychological warfare was as effective as direct assault. Every casualty they inflicted stretched the medical resources thinner, demoralized the defenders, and brought the base closer to the breaking point where survival became impossible. Through the reinforced windows, Veena could see Colonel Walsh moving between defensive positions, trying to maintain morale while dealing with a tactical situation that offered no good options. The colonel's face showed the strain of command decisions that balanced soldier welfare against mission requirements, knowing that every choice could mean the difference between life and death for the people under her protection. A new voice crackled through the base communication system, cutting through the ambient noise of groaning wounded and whispered conversations. "Thunderbase, this is Reaper 6. We have eyes on your position and are tracking multiple hostile sniper teams in the surrounding high ground." Reaper 6 was the call sign for an aerial reconnaissance drone that had finally reached their area of operations. Though without weapon systems, it could only observe rather than engage the enemy positions. "Reaper 6, Thunderbase," came Colonel Walsh's voice over the radio. "Can you provide precise coordinates for the hostile positions?" "Roger, Thunderbase. We count 6 confirmed sniper positions, ranges from 2,200 to 3,700 meters from your perimeter. Primary threat appears to be on the eastern ridge at grid coordinates." The drone operator's voice provided a string of numbers that Veena mentally converted to the exact position she'd been studying through the Tower 3 scope. 3,700 meters. The same position where Rodriguez's patrol had spotted the command post, now transformed into a fortress that commanded the entire battlefield. From that position, a skilled sniper could control all movement within the base and systematically eliminate key personnel until organized resistance became impossible. "Reaper 6, what's the assessment for close air support?" Walsh asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good news. "Thunderbase, weather is deteriorating rapidly to the north. Current estimate for attack aircraft availability is 18 to 24 hours. Recommend you maintain defensive positions and minimize exposure until air assets can engage. 18 to 24 hours. An eternity when facing an enemy that could kill with impunity from positions beyond retaliation. Veena looked around the aid station at the wounded soldiers who represented just the beginning of what would become a massacre if the situation continued unchanged. That's when she made her decision. Veena carefully removed her medical gloves and walked to the communication station where Colonel Walsh was coordinating the defense. The colonel looked up as she approached, noting the determined expression on the medic's face. "Sir," Veena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "I need to speak with you about the Barrett rifle in the arms room." Walsh frowned, clearly not understanding where the conversation was heading. "Corporal Granada, we've already discussed this. We don't have qualified personnel to operate that weapon system." "Actually, sir, we do." Veena reached into her medical bag and pulled out a folder she'd been carrying for 18 months, her original marksmanship qualifications, training records, and certification documents for the Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle system. "I'm fully qualified on that weapon, sir, certified for extreme range precision shooting and tactical employment." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant crack of another sniper round impacting somewhere within the base perimeter. Colonel Walsh took the folder and examined its contents, her eyebrows rising as she read through qualifications that painted a very different picture of the soldier standing before her. "Corporal Granada," Walsh said slowly, "according to these documents, you're certified for precision shooting out to 4,000 meters?" "Yes, sir." "The Eastern Ridge position is well within my effective range." Walsh looked at her for a long moment, clearly struggling to reconcile the medic she thought she knew with the highly trained marksman described in the documentation. Around them, the command bunker had grown quiet as other personnel overheard the conversation and began to understand its implications. "You're telling me," Walsh said carefully, "that while you've been working as a medic for the past 18 months, you've actually been qualified to operate our longest-range precision weapon?" "Yes, sir. I've been maintaining proficiency during off-duty hours, using the surveillance equipment to practice range estimation and environmental assessment." The colonel closed the folder and looked directly into Veena's eyes. "Corporal Granada, that position on the Eastern Ridge has been the source of our most effective enemy fire. The range is extreme, the shot would be incredibly difficult, and you'd be operating alone with no backup." "I understand, sir." "If you miss, or if there are multiple targets in that position, you'll have revealed our only long-range capability without eliminating the threat." "Yes, sir." Walsh was quiet for another moment, weighing the risks of trusting their survival to a soldier who'd been dismissed as support personnel. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Corporal Granada, you have my authorization to attempt engagement of the Eastern Ridge position, God help us all." The arms room at Forward Operating Base Thunder smelled of gun oil and steel, a familiar scent that transported Veena back to her days at Fort Benning when precision shooting had been her future rather than her secret. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the base armorer, looked skeptical as he unlocked the heavy steel cabinet that housed the Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle, his weathered hands moving with the careful respect that all soldiers learn to show around weapons capable of changing the course of battles. "You sure about this, Doc?" Torres asked, lifting the massive rifle from its foam-lined case. The Barrett was a beast of engineering, weighing nearly 30 pounds and stretching over 4 feet in length. Its muzzle brake was designed to redirect the enormous blast of gases produced by the .50 caliber cartridge, and its bipod legs could extend to provide a stable shooting platform for the kind of precision work that separated professionals from amateurs. "I'm sure," Veena replied, accepting the rifle and immediately checking its action with movements that spoke of deep familiarity rather than recent training. Her hands found the controls automatically: safety, bolt handle, trigger assembly, each component exactly where muscle memory insisted it should be. Torres watched her with growing interest as she performed a detailed inspection of the weapon system. "Haven't seen anyone handle the Barrett like that since Sergeant Martinez rotated out. You really know this rifle?" "Better than I know most people," Veena answered, examining the scope mounting system and adjusting the bipod legs to their proper length. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, a tool that had been waiting patiently for the right hands to unlock its potential. The Barrett M82 was chambered for the .50 BMG cartridge, a round originally designed for use against aircraft and light armored vehicles. In the hands of a skilled marksman, It could reach out to distances approaching 2 miles and deliver enough energy to stop virtually any target with a single shot. The specific rifle Torres had handed her was equipped with a loopholed Mark IV scope capable of magnifications up to 16 power, perfect for the kind of extreme range work she was contemplating. "What kind of ammunition do we have available?" Vina asked, opening the case that contained the rifle's accessories and spare parts. Torres consulted his inventory sheets. 200 rounds of M33 ball ammunition, 50 rounds of M8 armor-piercing incendiary, and about 30 rounds of M903 slap. That's the saboted light armor penetrator stuff. Vina nodded, her mind automatically calculating the ballistic characteristics of each ammunition type. For a target at 3,700 meters, the M33 ball ammunition would be most appropriate. Its 661-grain bullet had the stability and energy retention necessary for extreme-range precision work, and its ballistic coefficient would give her the best chance of achieving the accuracy she needed. "I'll need 10 rounds of the M33, a spotting scope, rangefinder, and weather monitoring equipment," she said, beginning to assemble the gear she would need for what might be the most important shot of her military career. As Torres gathered the requested equipment, word of Vina's mission had begun to spread throughout the base. The same soldiers who had dismissed her as just a medic were now watching with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope, as she prepared to attempt something that seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand the science of extreme-range shooting. Corporal Jenkins appeared in the arms room doorway, his face showing the strain of the past 24 hours. "Doc, Colonel Walsh wants to know your estimated time for mission execution." Vina looked at her watch and mentally calculated the preparation time she would need. 2 hours for final equipment checks and environmental assessment, then I'll be ready to engage." 2 hours? Jenkins looked confused. "Can't you just, point and shoot?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what precision shooting actually involved, especially at ranges that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. Vina had learned long ago that most people thought sniping was simply a matter of good eyesight and steady hands, when in reality it was more like applied physics combined with meteorology and psychology. "At 3,700 meters, I'm dealing with a bullet flight time of approximately 4 seconds, Vina explained, loading the massive cartridges into the Barrett's magazine. "During that time, wind conditions can change, the target can move, and atmospheric pressure variations can affect the bullet's trajectory by several feet. I need to understand every variable that could influence the shot." She slung the heavy rifle across her shoulder and began collecting the additional equipment she would need: a portable weather station for measuring wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, a laser rangefinder for precise distance measurement, and a ballistic calculator that would help her account for the dozens of environmental factors that affected long-range shooting. The walk to Tower 3 required careful movement through the base's tunnel system, avoiding exposure to the enemy snipers who continued their deadly overwatch of the compound. The Barrett rifle's bulk made navigation through the narrow passages challenging, but Vina had planned her route carefully during her months of secret practice sessions. Tower 3 offered the best angle of approach to the eastern ridge position, with a clear line of sight that avoided most of the intervening terrain features that could deflect or destabilize her bullet during its long flight to the target. The tower's reinforced construction would also provide protection from return fire, assuming she survived long enough for the enemy to locate her position and respond. Inside the tower, Vina began the meticulous process of preparing for a shot that would test every skill she'd developed during her advanced marksmanship training. She set up the weather monitoring equipment and began recording environmental conditions, noting wind speed and direction at ground level, while using the high-powered spotting scope to observe wind indicators at various altitudes between her position and the target. And the meteorological data painted a complex picture of atmospheric conditions that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistic calculations. Surface winds were relatively calm at 3 to 5 miles per hour from the northwest, but at higher altitudes, she could see evidence of crosswinds that could push her bullet significantly off course during its 4-second flight to the target. Through the spotting scope, she could clearly see the enemy position on the eastern ridge. The Taliban had constructed a well-camouflaged fighting position among the rocks, with multiple firing ports that allowed them to engage targets throughout the base, while remaining protected from return fire. She could make out the distinctive outline of a high-powered rifle barrel protruding from one of the openings, confirming that this was indeed the source of the devastating long-range fire that had pinned down the base. As she studied the target area, movement caught her attention. A figure appeared briefly in one of the firing ports. A man wearing traditional Afghan clothing but handling his rifle with the professional competence of someone who had received serious military training. This wasn't a local farmer pressed into service by the Taliban. This was a skilled marksman who understood his business and had positioned himself perfectly to control the battlefield. Veena opened her notebook and began recording detailed observations of the target area. She noted the exact position of the primary firing port, identified potential secondary positions where the sniper might relocate after her shot, and calculated firing solutions for multiple scenarios. The range to the target was 687 meters according to her laser rangefinder, well within the Barrett's theoretical maximum range, but at the extreme edge of what most military doctrine considered practical for precision engagement. The ballistic calculations required careful consideration of factors that most people never imagined could affect the flight of a bullet. At this range, the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, would deflect her bullet several inches to the right during its flight time. The difference in altitude between her position and the target would affect the bullet's trajectory, requiring compensation for both gravitational drop and the reduced air density at higher elevations. Most challenging of all were the wind conditions. Her weather instruments showed relatively stable conditions at her altitude, but the 4-second flight time meant that wind variations anywhere along the bullet's path could affect the outcome. She needed to read the terrain between her position and the target, identifying ridgelines and valleys that could channel or deflect air currents in ways that would influence her shot. As she worked through the calculations, using both her electronic ballistic calculator and the manual computation methods she'd learned during advanced training, Veena became aware that she was no longer alone in the tower. Corporal Jenkins had quietly joined her, along with several other soldiers who watched her preparations with growing amazement. "Doc," Jenkins said softly, "we never knew you could do stuff like this." Veena didn't look up from her calculations. Most people see what they expect to see. "You expected a medic, so that's what you saw." Private Rodriguez, one of the soldiers she'd treated for heat exhaustion, spoke up from the back of the group. "Ma'am, is it really possible to hit something from this distance?" Veena finally looked up from her notebook, meeting the eyes of soldiers who had dismissed her capabilities for 18 months, but now looked at her with something approaching reverence. "Private, the Barrett rifle is capable of accuracy better than 1 minute of angle at this range. That means I can theoretically place a bullet within a 36-inch circle at 3,700 meters. "Theoretically?" Jenkins asked. "Theory and practice are two different things," Veena replied, returning to her calculations. "But if I do everything right, if I read the wind correctly, if I account for all the environmental factors, if I control my breathing and trigger squeeze perfectly, then yes, it's possible." What she didn't say was that everything right at this range required a level of precision that allowed for almost no margin of error. A slight miscalculation in wind compensation could result in a miss by several feet. A moment of unsteady breathing could throw the shot off by enough to miss the target entirely. Even with perfect execution, she was attempting something that pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible with the equipment available. But as another mortar round impacted near the base perimeter and the crack of enemy sniper fire echoed across the compound, Veena knew that impossible was the only option left. In less than 2 hours, she would line up the most important shot of her life, knowing that success meant salvation for everyone on the base, while failure meant watching helplessly as the enemy continued their systematic destruction of everything she'd sworn to protect. The calculations were complete, the equipment was ready, all that remained was the shot itself. The moment of truth arrived with the subtle shift in wind patterns that Veena had been monitoring for the past hour. At 1,347 hours, the atmospheric conditions aligned perfectly with her ballistic calculations. Surface winds steady at 4 miles per hour from the northwest, high-altitude indicators showing minimal crosswind activity, and barometric pressure stable at the readings she'd incorporated into her firing solution. Through the loopholed scope mounted on the Barrett M82, the enemy sniper position appeared as clear as if it were only a few hundred meters away rather than nearly 4 kilometers. The 16x magnification revealed details that would have been invisible to the naked eye. The carefully constructed rock barriers that provided cover, the precision-cut firing ports that allowed engagement while minimizing exposure, and, most importantly, the distinctive outline of a rifle barrel that had been terrorizing the base for the past 18 hours. Veena settled into her shooting position behind the massive rifle, feeling the familiar comfort of perfect alignment between body, weapon, and target. The Barrett's bipod legs were adjusted to the exact height that provided optimal stability, and she'd positioned sandbags to support the rifle's stock at the precise angle calculated to compensate for the bullet's trajectory over the extreme distance to the target. Behind her, Tower 3 had become crowded with soldiers who had quietly gathered to witness what might be the most important shot fired at forward operating base Thunder. Colonel Walsh stood near the communication equipment, ready to coordinate the base's response regardless of whether Veena's shot succeeded or failed. Corporal Jenkins watched through a spotting scope, prepared to call corrections if a second shot became necessary. Even Staff Sergeant Thompson, his arm in a sling from the previous night's wounds, had made his way to the tower to see the medic he'd mocked attempt something that defied conventional understanding of infantry combat. "Wind indicators are stable," Jenkins reported quietly, reading the atmospheric conditions through his spotting scope. "No significant changes in the flight path." Veena acknowledged with a slight nod, her attention focused entirely on the complex sequence of mental and physical actions required for precision shooting at extreme range. She controlled her breathing, allowing her heart rate to settle into the steady rhythm that would minimize movement during the critical moment of trigger squeeze. Her eye found the scope's reticle, and she began the final alignment process that would determine success or failure. The ballistic solution she'd calculated required holding the crosshairs 127 minutes of angle above the target to compensate for gravitational bullet drop over the 687-meter distance. At this range, the .50 caliber bullet would fall nearly 40 feet during its 4-second flight time, requiring her to aim at what appeared to be empty sky above the enemy position. Additionally, she needed to hold 23 minutes of angle to the left to compensate for wind drift and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. To anyone watching through binoculars, it would appear that she was aiming at nothing but air and rock. Only someone who understood the physics of extreme-range ballistics would recognize that her point of aim was precisely calculated to intersect with her target after the bullet completed its long, arcing trajectory through the thin mountain air. As she settled into her final shooting position, Veena became aware of the complete silence that had fallen over Tower 3. Even the background noise of the base's defensive activities seemed muted, as if everyone understood that this moment would determine whether they lived to see another sunset or became casualties of an enemy that had seemed untouchable until now. Through her scope, she could see movement in the target area. The enemy sniper was repositioning, adjusting his own weapon for what would likely be another shot at the trapped American forces. The irony wasn't lost on her. Two professional marksmen, separated by almost 4 kilometers of rugged terrain, engaged in a deadly chess match where the first accurate shot would determine the outcome of the entire siege. "Target movement," Jenkins whispered. "He's settling into a firing position." Veena could see it too. The enemy sniper was preparing to engage another target within the base, probably unaware that he was about to become the target himself. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he would fire, and once he did, he would likely relocate to a secondary position, forcing her to recalculate everything and attempt an even more difficult shot. This was her moment, 4 seconds, from trigger squeeze to impact. 4 seconds that would either save the lives of everyone on the base or leave them defensively helpless against an enemy that could kill with impunity from the surrounding mountains. Veena took a deep breath, released half of it, and began the slow, steady trigger squeeze that she'd practiced thousands of times during her advanced marksmanship training. The Barrett's trigger was set to break at exactly 4 pounds of pressure, and she applied force with the deliberate control of someone who understood that the slightest deviation could send her bullet meters off target at this extreme range. The rifle fired with a thunderous roar that echoed off the tower's walls and reverberated across the base like an announcement that the rules of engagement had just changed. The massive muzzle brake directed the blast of gases sideways, creating a shockwave that knocked dust from the ceiling and rattled equipment throughout the observation post. Through her scope, Veena watched the vapor trail of her bullet arc across the clear mountain air, carrying with it the hopes and survival of everyone trapped within the base perimeter. 4 seconds stretched into eternity as the half-inch projectile covered nearly 4 kilometers at over 800 feet per second, fighting against gravity, wind resistance, and atmospheric conditions that could deflect it by inches or feet depending on factors too numerous to fully predict. The bullet followed its calculated trajectory, climbing high above the intervening terrain before beginning its terminal descent toward the target area. Through the spotting scope, Jenkins tracked the bullet's vapor trail with professional intensity. Flight time, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, impact! The enemy sniper position erupted in a cloud of dust and rock fragments as the .50 caliber bullet struck with devastating effect. The carefully constructed fighting position that had seemed impregnable from conventional weapons suddenly revealed its vulnerability to precision fire delivered with surgical accuracy from extreme range. "Target down!" Jenkins shouted, his voice carrying across the tower and immediately being relayed throughout the base communication system. "Sniper eliminated!" The silence that followed lasted only seconds before Tower 3 erupted in cheers and congratulations from soldiers who had witnessed something that would become legend in military circles. Vina had accomplished what military doctrine considered nearly impossible: a precision kill shot at a range approaching 4 kilometers, delivered under combat conditions with a single round. But even as the celebration began around her, Vina remained focused on the tactical situation. The elimination of the primary sniper position was significant, but intelligence had identified 5 additional enemy positions scattered throughout the mountains. Her shot had removed the most dangerous threat, but the siege wasn't over yet. Colonel Walsh's voice cut through the celebration. "Outstanding shot, Corporal Granada. Now we need to capitalize on this advantage. Can you engage the secondary positions?" Vina was already adjusting her scope and consulting her notebook for the firing solution she'd calculated for the other enemy locations. The nearest secondary position was at 890 meters, still extreme range but significantly closer than her first target. More importantly, the enemy snipers would now know that the Americans possessed long-range precision capability, and they would likely attempt to relocate or take cover. "Affirmative, sir," Vina replied, chambering another .50 caliber round and beginning the target acquisition process for the next threat. "Give me 5 minutes to adjust for the new range and wind conditions." Through her scope, she could already see movement at the secondary positions, as the enemy reacted to the sudden elimination of their primary marksman. Some were attempting to relocate, while others were trying to identify the source of the devastating return fire that had just announced the arrival of a new player in their carefully planned siege. What they didn't yet understand was that the new player was a medic who had spent 18 months being dismissed and overlooked while secretly maintaining skills that could reach out and touch targets at distances they considered safe. Vina Granada had fired the shot that broke the siege, but the battle was far from over. As she prepared for her second engagement, Vina realized that everything had changed in the 4 seconds it took her bullet to travel 687 meters. She was no longer the medic who bandaged wounds and handed out aspirin. She was the sniper who had just proven that distance was no protection against precision, skill, and the determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Barrett rifle was already loaded with a second round, and 5 more enemy positions awaited her attention. The siege of Forward Operating Base Thunder was about to become a demonstration of why underestimating people based on their job description could be a fatal mistake. The psychological impact of Vina's first shot rippled through the enemy positions like an earthquake, fundamentally altering the tactical dynamics that had given the Taliban complete control over the battlefield. Through her scope, she could observe the immediate chaos that followed the elimination of their primary sniper, fighters scrambling between positions, frantic radio communications, and the unmistakable signs of an enemy force that had suddenly realized their supposedly impregnable positions were anything but safe. The second target presented a different challenge entirely. Located 890 meters to the northwest on a rocky outcropping that commanded excellent fields of fire over the base's western approaches, this position had been responsible for the mortar fire that had devastated several key buildings during the initial assault. Unlike the first target, which had been a static sniper position, this location housed a crew-served weapon that required multiple personnel to operate effectively. Through the high-powered scope, Vina could see at least 3 figures moving around what appeared to be an 82mm mortar tube, their movements increasingly urgent as they attempted to relocate their weapon before the American sniper could acquire them as targets. The technical challenge was compounded by the fact that she needed to neutralize the weapon system itself, not just the personnel operating it. "Range to target 2890, Corporal Jenkins called out, tracking the enemy movement through his spotting scope. "Multiple personnel, crew-served weapon." They're attempting to displace. Veena made rapid adjustments to her scope settings, accounting for the reduced range and slight change in atmospheric conditions caused by the different elevation and aspect angle to the new target. At 890 meters, her bullet would still require significant compensation for drop and wind drift, but the reduced flight time of approximately 3 seconds gave the enemy less opportunity to relocate before impact. The ballistic calculation for this engagement required a different approach. Rather than targeting individual personnel who could take cover behind the rocky terrain, she needed to disable the mortar tube itself, turning the crew-served weapon into useless metal and denying the enemy their ability to rain indirect fire on the base. A .50 caliber bullet striking the mortar's tube or base plate would render the weapon inoperable, regardless of whether the crew survived the engagement. Wind conditions holding steady, Jenkins reported. Target is stationary for the moment, but they're working to break down the weapon. Veena could see the enemy mortar crew's frantic efforts to disassemble their weapon and relocate to a position where they assumed they would be safe from the mysterious American sniper, who had just demonstrated the ability to reach out nearly 4 kilometers. What they didn't understand was that 890 meters was well within the comfort zone for someone trained on the Barrett system. She aligned her crosshairs on the mortar tube's base, where a .50 caliber impact would cause maximum damage to the weapon's critical components. The holdoff for this range was significantly less than her first shot, only 78 minutes of angle for elevation and 16 minutes for windage. But the target was smaller and partially obscured by the rocky terrain that the enemy had chosen for concealment. The trigger squeeze was deliberate and controlled, her breathing pattern synchronized with the natural rhythm that allowed for maximum stability during the critical moment of bullet release. The Barrett roared again, its massive report echoing across the base and announcing to every defender that their guardian angel was still working. The .50 caliber bullet struck the mortar tube with devastating precision, the impact visible even at extreme range as metal fragments and debris scattered across the rocky outcropping. The weapon that had terrorized the base with indirect fire was instantly transformed into twisted scrap metal, and the crew that had operated it was either eliminated or forced to abandon their position without the means to continue their bombardment. "Target destroyed!" Jenkins shouted, his voice carrying the excitement of soldiers who were finally seeing their tormentors receive the justice they'd been unable to deliver themselves. "Mortar position is out of action!" But there was no time to celebrate the second success. Through her scope, Veena was already acquiring the third target, a machine gun position located 240 meters to the south that had been interdicting the base's supply routes and preventing medical evacuation helicopters from landing safely. This position represented a different tactical challenge. It was mobile, well-concealed, and operated by personnel who were now acutely aware that nowhere was beyond the reach of the American precision shooter. The enemy machine gun crew had learned from the fate of their companions. Instead of remaining in their primary position, they were conducting what military tacticians call a shoot-and-scoot operation, firing brief bursts before immediately relocating to avoid counter-battery fire. The technique was designed to prevent exactly the kind of precision engagement that Veena was attempting. "Target 3 is mobile," Jenkins reported with frustration. "They're displacing after every burst of fire. Getting a clean shot is going to be difficult." Veena studied the terrain around the enemy position, looking for patterns in their movement and identifying the natural corridors that would channel their displacement between firing positions. The rocky landscape offered limited concealment, and the enemy's need to maintain fields of fire over the base created constraints on where they could effectively relocate. "They're moving between 3 prepared positions," she observed, tracking the machine gun team's movement through her scope. "Same team, rotating positions to avoid counterfire, but they have to maintain the same general area to keep their fields of fire." The tactical solution required patience and prediction rather than immediate engagement. Veena needed to identify the pattern in the enemy's movement and position herself for a shot during their next displacement. The machine gun crew was following standard infantry doctrine for avoiding counter-battery fire, but that doctrine assumed they were facing conventional weapons with limited range and accuracy. For the next 10 minutes, Veena studied the enemy's movement pattern while maintaining her shooting position behind the Barrett. The machine gun crew was rotating between 3 positions in a roughly triangular pattern, spending approximately 2 minutes in each location before displacing to the next. The movement between positions required them to cross a small clearing that offered perhaps a 3-second window of vulnerability. Next displacement should be in 30 seconds, Vina announced, aligning her crosshairs on the clearing where the enemy would be forced to expose themselves during their movement between positions. Range is 3240, flight time approximately 3.2 seconds. The calculation required her to predict not just where the enemy would be when her bullet arrived, but also to account for their speed of movement across the terrain. At 240 meters, even a walking pace would carry personnel several feet during the bullet's flight time, requiring her to lead the target like a hunter tracking game. Through her scope, she saw the first movement as the machine gun crew began their displacement. Two figures emerged from their concealed position, carrying the weapon and ammunition between them as they moved toward their next firing position. The window of opportunity was exactly as she'd calculated, perhaps 3 seconds of exposure before they reached the cover of their alternate position. Vina's trigger squeeze was timed to coincide with the moment when the enemy team would reach the center of the clearing, accounting for both their movement speed and her bullet's flight time. The Barrett's third shot of the engagement split the air with the same thunderous authority as the previous two, carrying death across more than 3 kilometers of rugged mountain terrain. The impact was devastating. The .50 caliber bullet struck the leading figure's center mass, the massive projectile's energy instantly eliminating the target and causing the second team member to drop the machine gun and dive for cover among the rocks. The crew-served weapon that had prevented medical evacuation and resupply operations was abandoned in the clearing, its crew either eliminated or too demoralized to continue their mission. "Target eliminated," Jenkins called out, his voice now carrying the confidence of soldiers who had learned that their enemies were no longer beyond retaliation. "Machine gun position is neutralized." The base communication system crackled with reports from defensive positions throughout the compound. With 3 of the 6 enemy sniper positions eliminated or abandoned, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically in favor of the defenders. Personnel could move between buildings without the constant threat of precision fire, medical evacuation helicopters could approach the landing zone, and the psychological pressure that had paralyzed the base's operations was finally lifting. Colonel Walsh's voice came through the tower's communication system. "Corporal Granada, I'm receiving reports that enemy positions 4, 5, and 6 appear to be withdrawing. Your actions have broken their coordinated attack." Through her scope, Vina could confirm the colonel's assessment. The remaining enemy positions were abandoning their carefully prepared sites, their personnel moving deeper into the mountains rather than risk engagement with an American sniper who had just demonstrated the ability to reach out and eliminate targets at ranges they had considered impossible. The siege of forward operating Base Thunder was effectively over, broken not by air support or artillery bombardment, but by a medic with a .50 caliber rifle and the skills to use it with surgical precision. In less than an hour, Vina had transformed the tactical situation from desperate defense to overwhelming American advantage. But as she began the process of safing her weapon and preparing to return to her medical duties, Vina realized that everything had changed permanently. She was no longer the overlooked medic who bandaged wounds and handed out aspirin. Word of her impossible shots would spread throughout the military, carrying with it a new understanding of what was possible when skill met opportunity, regardless of what someone's job description might say. The Barrett M82 had spoken 3 times, and each time it had delivered a message that enemy forces throughout the region would remember. Distance was no protection against precision, and those who threatened American forces did so at their own peril, regardless of how far away they thought they were hiding. 2 weeks after the siege, the morning sun rose over forward operating Base Thunder to reveal a completely transformed atmosphere. The smoke and debris had been cleared away, the damaged buildings were undergoing repair, and most importantly, the crushing psychological weight of being trapped under enemy observation had lifted. Soldiers moved freely between positions, helicopters landed and departed on schedule, and the base had returned to the normal rhythm of military operations in a combat zone. Vina stood in the rebuilt aid station, reviewing medical supply inventories and patient charts, when the notification came through the base communication system that would change her life forever. Her presence was requested immediately in the command bunker for what was described only as an important briefing. The walk to the command center took her past groups of soldiers who now looked at her with expressions she'd never seen during her 18 months as the base medic. There were no more dismissive glances or mocking comments about playing doctor. Instead, she saw nods of respect, genuine smiles, and the kind of acknowledgement that was reserved for soldiers who had proven themselves under fire. Word of her impossible shots had spread far beyond the base perimeter, carried by radio communications, intelligence reports, and the kind of soldier-to-soldier storytelling that created legends. Inside the command bunker, she found an assembly that made her pause at the entrance. Colonel Walsh stood at the head of a conference table, surrounded by officers she didn't recognize. Uniforms bearing insignia from division headquarters, special operations units, and what appeared to be representatives from the Pentagon's precision shooting programs. At the far end of the table sat a figure who made her heart stop. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, the instructor whose dismissive attitude had derailed her sniper career 2 years earlier. "Corporal Granada," Colonel Walsh began, her voice carrying the formal tone reserved for significant announcements. "Please take a seat. We have some important matters to discuss." As Vina settled into the indicated chair, Colonel Walsh gestured toward the assembled officers. "These gentlemen have traveled from various commands to discuss your recent actions and their implications for our understanding of long-range precision capabilities." Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison from Division Headquarters opened a folder containing what appeared to be detailed analysis reports. "Corporal Granada, your 3 shots during the recent siege have been thoroughly analyzed by our ballistics experts and combat assessment teams. The ranges, accuracy, and tactical impact represent performance levels that exceed current military doctrine for precision shooting capabilities." He paused, consulting his notes before continuing. "Your first shot, a kill at 687 meters under combat conditions, represents the longest confirmed precision engagement by U.S. forces in this theater of operations. The technical difficulty of that shot, combined with the tactical situation and time pressure involved, places it among the most remarkable achievements in modern military history." Major Sarah Chen from the Special Operations community leaned forward, her expression showing the kind of professional interest that Vina recognized from her advanced training days. "More importantly, your actions during the siege demonstrate capabilities that our current personnel assignment and training systems apparently failed to identify and utilize properly." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a recently fired rifle. The military's bureaucratic machinery had buried talent that could have been saving lives and completing critical missions, relegated to medical support duties while combat units struggled with precision shooting challenges that were well within her proven capabilities. Master Sergeant Hayes finally spoke, his voice lacking the dismissive authority she remembered from their confrontational training exercise. "Corporal Granada, I've reviewed the ballistic analysis of your shots, your original training records, and the circumstances that led to your reassignment to medical duties." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to acknowledge. "I was wrong. My assessment of your capabilities was influenced by factors that had nothing to do with your technical competence or combat potential." The admission from the man who had derailed her career carried more weight than any formal commendation. Master Sergeant Hayes was a legend in precision shooting circles, someone whose opinion could make or break careers in the sniper community. His public acknowledgement that he had been wrong would reverberate throughout the military's precision shooting programs. Colonel Walsh opened another folder and spread several documents across the table. "Corporal Granada, effective immediately, you're being offered several options for your continued military service. The first is immediate assignment to the Army's premier precision shooting school as an instructor, where your demonstrated capabilities would be used to train the next generation of military marksmen." Major Chen took over the presentation. "The second option is assignment to a special operations unit, where your medical training combined with your precision shooting skills would make you uniquely valuable for missions requiring both capabilities." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison presented the third option, full reassignment to a conventional sniper unit at the rank of Staff Sergeant, with retroactive promotion recognition and immediate enrollment in advanced precision shooting programs. The offers represented everything Vina had dreamed of when she first entered advanced marksmanship training, opportunities that would have been hers 2 years ago if institutional bias and bureaucratic inertia hadn't buried her qualifications under medical assignment paperwork. But as she looked around the table at officers who were now eager to claim her talents, she realized that her perspective had evolved during her time as a base medic. "Sirs," she said carefully, "I appreciate these opportunities, and I understand their significance for my career. But I need to ask about a fourth option that isn't on your list." Colonel Walsh raised her eyebrows. What did you have in mind, Corporal? I'd like to remain here at Forward Operating Base Thunder, but with a dual assignment that recognizes both my medical and precision shooting capabilities. Vina's voice grew stronger as she explained her reasoning. During the siege, I wasn't just a sniper who happened to be available. I was a medic who understood the tactical situation from a medical perspective, who had treated the casualties caused by the enemy positions I was engaging, and who could apply precision shooting skills to solve a problem that conventional approaches couldn't address. She gestured toward the window that overlooked the base where soldiers were going about their daily routines, no longer fearing invisible death from the surrounding mountains. There are other bases throughout this theater facing similar challenges. Enemy forces who've learned to use terrain and distance to neutralize our conventional capabilities. Those situations require someone who can bridge multiple specialties, not just another sniper or another medic. Major Chen nodded slowly, her expression showing growing interest. You're proposing a new type of assignment, medical personnel with advanced precision shooting capabilities as a combat multiplier. Exactly. Someone who can treat casualties caused by enemy precision shooters, then eliminate those threats using skills that most medical personnel don't possess. Vina pulled out the notebook she'd carried throughout the siege, filled with range cards, medical treatment protocols, and tactical observations. I've spent the last 2 weeks developing concepts for integrating medical and precision shooting capabilities at the small unit level. The room fell silent as the assembled officers considered the implications of what she was proposing. Traditional military organizations separated medical and combat functions, but Vina's actions during the siege had demonstrated the potential value of combining specialties in ways that doctrine had never envisioned. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison spoke first. Corporal Granada, what you're describing would require developing entirely new training programs, assignment structures, and operational concepts. Yes, sir, but it would also create capabilities that enemies won't know how to counter because they've never seen anything like it before.
Master Sergeant Hayes, who had been listening intently, finally contributed to the discussion. In Vietnam, we had personnel who crossed traditional specialty boundaries out of necessity. Some of our most effective operations involved individuals who could fill multiple roles as situations demanded. He looked directly at Vina. What you did during the siege wasn't just exceptional shooting. It was tactical innovation under pressure. Colonel Walsh gathered the documents spread across the table and closed the folders. Corporal Granada, I'm going to recommend that your fourth option be given serious consideration at the highest levels. Your actions here have implications that extend far beyond individual career assignments. As the meeting concluded and the visiting officers prepared to depart, Major Chen approached Vina privately. Between you and me, she said quietly, what you accomplished during that siege is going to change how the military thinks about talent identification and assignment flexibility. You've proven that our current systems miss critical capabilities by focusing too narrowly on traditional job classifications. Later that evening, as Vina completed her medical duties and prepared for another night of maintaining surveillance over the surrounding terrain, now as an officially recognized responsibility rather than secret practice, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 18 months ago, she'd been a disappointed soldier whose career had been derailed by institutional bias and bureaucratic politics. She'd been dismissed as just a medic by people who couldn't see beyond traditional role definitions. But those 18 months had given her something that no training program could provide. The perspective that came from being underestimated, the patience that came from waiting for the right moment, and the determination that came from knowing she had capabilities that could save lives if given the opportunity. The Barrett M82 that had broken the siege now rested in a position of honor in the base armory, but it was available for immediate deployment whenever Vina's unique combination of skills might be needed. Her medical bag sat beside her rifle case, symbols of a new kind of military professional who refused to be limited by conventional expectations. Staff Sergeant Thompson, his arm now healed from the wounds he'd sustained during the siege, approached her as she finished her evening medical rounds. "Doc," he said, his voice carrying none of the mockery that had once characterized their interactions. "I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you before. I thought I knew what made a soldier valuable, but I was measuring with the wrong ruler." Vina looked at him with the understanding that came from proving herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Sergeant, we all have our own definitions of what makes someone valuable. Sometimes it takes extraordinary circumstances to reveal capabilities that were always there. As the sun set behind the Hindu Kush mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and red that had marked the morning of the siege, Vina Granada stood on the observation deck of Tower 3 and surveyed the landscape that had become the proving ground for her transformation from dismissed medic to legendary marksman. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply her unique combination of skills, and new chances to prove that the most dangerous weapons often come in the most unexpected packages. But tonight, she was content to watch over her base and her fellow soldiers, knowing that she had found her place in a world that finally recognized her true worth. The siege was over, but the legend had just begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.